Hello, and welcome to The Table. This is Edible Empire, a podcast series about the hidden cost of our food. Hosted by Planet Pulse Pacific, we're your hosts, Ben, Emma, and Neil, with Kelly on editing. Connecting from across the globe, we would like to take a moment and acknowledge the traditional custodians and their millennia of stewardship. We honour their deep, ongoing connection to lands and environments that we discuss throughout the series. So grubs up, a tub, food's ready, let's begin.
All of us will be aware of the globalised nature of our food today. You pop down to the supermarkets and see avocados from Peru, Granny Smith apples from South Africa, and green beans from Kenya. This globalisation has been vital in allowing us to have year-round supplies of seasonal produce, but it also gives access to low-cost ingredients and products, making use of geographies, politics, and economies elsewhere in the world. But what's not so widely known is why our food system looks the way it does today. Why do we import certain goods from so far away? How did we become so dependent on tea and coffee, sugar and rice? The long history of global food trade developed hand in hand with global empires and political control. Throughout this podcast, we'll be looking at the past and present of these food empires to try to understand the problems that the world faces today.
In this episode, we focus on the history of our food system, how centuries of political organisation have created a globalised network of complex food supply chains, and just how today's food system is broken. Food regimes are one of the most widely used concepts in academic literature to understand how food systems around the world operate. The term highlights how food is politically and economically organised, and that how we produce and consume food today is linked to history, colonialism, and power. Professor Harriet Friedmann, Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of Toronto, co-developed this concept. So we wanted to talk to her and learn about how history has shaped today's food system. We talk about sugar and palm oil, the role of slavery in states, and whether we're now in a regime dominated by corporations. Later in this episode, we'll talk with Professor Patel, a political economist, academic, writer, documentary filmmaker, and activist at the University of Texas. He's written a range of books, including Stuffed and Starved, and History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, a guide to capitalism, nature, and the future of the planet. We were really excited to talk to Raj about just how broken the food system is, and the concept of food imperialism, how wealthy states and corporations control food production and consumption in the global south. Harriet, food has been traded between countries for an incredibly long period of time. Much of our supply chains evolving under the control of powerful political empires. Can you tell us a bit about why this history of imperial control and global food supplies is important?
Well, I would like to start with sugar and then say palm oil is kind of the other bookend. Palm oil really became crucial in a way it is now to the food system only in the 1990s. I understand, yes, it was a colonial crop used for other things, just like cotton was a colonial crop used for other things. So let me start with sugar and say that was the first major food. If we were to write it again, the food regime story, we wouldn't number them, or if we did, the first food regime would be the sugar regime, because it started with invading African countries and taking the young people out if they could, or paying people to bring them to the coast in order to enslave them and transport them to the slave colonies. And the U.S. was not a big deal. In Louisiana, there's still sugar. You can still see it, but it came late, and it was not the biggest one. It was the Caribbean, Brazil, that kind of climate. And the sugar, what it did was it became the major source of accumulation, as well as the slave trade. The two together were a package. And all kinds of new financial instruments were created to facilitate all this and to bring more people in to participating as investors, even on a very small scale, and brought in a whole lot of attachment to the slave trade. And at the same time, because so much of the early colonial expansion was centered on the metropolises, on London, what they did, these metropolises, they pretty well ignored their hinterlands and their own countries, what we now think of as national economies, because it was an imperial economy. It was the city and the colonies. And behind it were the stories we hear all the time about enclosures. So there was a lot of misery and disruption being created in the hinterland, a lot of people coming to the cities without what they used to have to eat. And sugar became a substitute for calories, for rum, for drugs. Death rates went up a lot. It was not a nice time, but it really worked for sugar plantation owners, for merchants, for slave traders. It was a very complex system that in a place like Jamaica, any of the Caribbean or northern Brazil, cleared the landscape, turned it into monocultures of this extremely difficult crop to grow, especially in the era long before chemical fertilizers. And it was that system, Sidney Mintz is the great source on this, Sweetness and Power, that created the industrial techniques that later became adopted in England and became what we think of as the Industrial Revolution. So the way that slave teams were organized in the plantations to cut the cane, the way the industrial processing of the sugar, which was highly technically sophisticated for the time and very dangerous work. And so they had these slave systems that organized what we later thought of as wage worker systems, and they later were wage worker systems, including in sugar. And what it did was it created monocultural landscapes, and it created a new diet that was not at all good for people, that was replacing something that had been quite healthy. And I would love to talk about what was there before 1500 anywhere in the world. There's a kind of an abstract way of describing what was particular always to each place. So that was the beginning, and it created an imperial system along with cotton, along with, the early palm oil, a lot of colonial crops, certainly cotton. It created the international division of labor we like to see, the specialization of places in particular crops that were very simplifying of the landscape and replaced what was there before, usually very complex cultures and ecosystems.
It is fascinating how those early sugar dynamics shape modern wage systems and ecosystems. If sugar was the defining crop of that era, how do we get to your second crop, palm oil? Why does that become such a dominant crop centuries later?
We're going to skip now several centuries. It's 1990s, we get to palm oil. Now, why would palm oil be grown on a vast scale? Well, first of all, what happened? They took it out of, as you say, these West African villages where it was a long part of the farming and a long part of the diet and the culture. So not only was it there for cooking, but it was palm oil and part of celebrations, and it varied from the Congo to other countries in West Africa. And it was part of their farming system. So there'd be a palm plant, a palm tree there, and there would be the vegetables and there would be the animals. And, it was a mixed farming system, as any sustainable farming system is, I would argue. So somebody had the bright idea to transplant it, just like sugar had been transplanted, by the way, from Asia, to these other places that were the new colonial suppliers of the empires. Just like that, they transplanted palm trees into vast plantations, displaced the people, displaced the tropical forests that were there.
It sounds like a devastating replication of the sugar model. What was driving that shift specifically? Why did palm oil suddenly become so attractive to the global food industry at that particular moment?
Now, sugar is kind of, I'm not sure it was actually an explanation, but to say there were people consuming the sugar and there were people trading the sugar and making a lot of money on it. Now, why was that so in the 1990s for palm oil? It's because in the meantime, in all those centuries, all those decades really, after World War II, when the chemicals and the machines got into agriculture and really deepened the monoculture, when later genetic technologies came in, but that wasn't particularly important for palm oil, might be now. So what happened is these complex food systems grew up with industries that hadn't existed before. All the fabulous, Kellogg's, and Kellogg started just doing cereal. The big food industries, Nestle, Nestle started as a colonial company, but all of these food industries became the dominant ones. So farmers, whoever remained, and the big monocultural producers were now supplying raw materials to the industries. And the industries were selling to increasingly supermarkets. That had to do with urban redesign in cars. It had a lot to do with a lot of things. But the food system changed so that agriculture was now serving a more centralized and industrialized and hierarchical food system. The hierarchical in the sense of more layers, not the difference between the top and the bottom. And so once the manufacturers are going, they are interested in cheapening their products and finding the most efficient way to do certain things. So palm oil turns out to have temperatures that make it more conducive to producing a range of food. So they just wanted it and demanded it. And so people who are corporations who wanted to supply that said, well, we're not going to do it in West Africa where people are already doing it. It's all complicated and, they're doing it with other things. We'll just transplant it to Asia first. I mean, it's now coming back to West Africa. It's gone to Latin America because once it's so profitable and once organizing monocultures is the way to make money and do things, and the resistance to that by the people who already live there, and certainly by the ecosystems that are being undermined. There's no resistance except causing problems. It just made it easier. And so palm oil turned out to be a very convenient crop for industrial food, or what I call edible commodities.
So do you think that this has continued to evolve now and that we're potentially now seeing a corporate food regime? Is it corporations that hold the power in the system?
Well, that's what Phil McMichael thinks. And, or I'm not sure what he thinks today. That's what he has thought in recent stuff he's written. The problem with that formulation is it leaves out the states. And so I'm going back there. And this is the argument I have with him. Because the rules of the system that determine what's profitable and what's possible and what's not possible are created in what are now very complicated state and interstate systems that work through the monetary system. The Latin American countries had already become formally independent, but they were caught in first the gold standard and then the monetary system of the dollar. And what it did was it encouraged national economic growth. It allowed governments to overvalue their currencies, which is why you had black markets, because they were overvalued, but it worked. And it allowed all these new independent governments to do certain things. And what they wanted to do was industrialize. This was the new goal. And they didn't care that much about their farmers. What they wanted was peace and good government. They didn't want too much disruption, but they were okay with people leaving the countryside and coming to cities. We have this nice word, urbanization, for that. And the reason was that they wanted cheap labor. And then we can get into how the food system itself worked through the subsidies of wheat, which is where I started this part of what I was doing. We can do that, and it changed the diet of people again toward wheat, even when it hadn't been. And if it had been, the farmers who were already producing wheat, like in North Africa, couldn't compete because it was coming in this industrially produced, highly subsidized way. This is not about food regimes, but I guess it is because food is at the center of everything, and it usually gets hidden. So I can't talk about certain things about food without talking about the monetary system. The monetary system also allowed the US to create food dependency in many parts of the world.
It is a really interesting shift to look at states and currencies rather than just corporations. How did the US government practically use its monetary power and wheat to create that global food dependency?
This is some of the stuff I'm best known for, of looking at the way that, for reasons having to do with internal politics, the US decided to subsidize its farmers in a particular way that caused it to buy at a higher price than a notional market price or anything the farmers could get otherwise to buy their wheat, and some other crops too, but wheat became the main thing. And that meant the government of the United States was holding vast quantities of wheat in storehouses. It was not a good look to just destroy it, which would have been probably the most efficient way to solve that problem, because what that was doing was depressing world prices. And so they were in this vicious cycle where the farmers couldn't get enough prices that was decided, agreed legislatively. So fixed prices were set higher than that. They had to, despite trying to open trade and everything else, they had to set import controls on wheat, because if the US government is buying wheat at a higher price than anybody else, everyone in the world is going to send it there. So it's going to make this problem worse. So they did do that, and they excluded agriculture from international trade agreements. That's why the World Trade Organization tried to bring in the agreement on agriculture in 1995. So the US was caught in this cycle, and the best thing to do with it turned out to solve, lots of birds with one stone or whatever. They could give or loan in notional currencies wheat to all kinds of countries. And that created a food dependency and a pressure on agriculture, even not only of wheat, of anything else. Like in Peru, where people are eating potatoes, if you can buy cheaper wheat and people are moving to the cities for all kinds of reasons, they start doing that. And so you create a more complex set of exchanges, which open up to a further deepening of the break between what's produced in a place and by people and by a culture and what's eaten there. And so once you do that, then prices determine everything, and governments are determining prices. I mean, really, it looks like corporations are, and sure, they are, but they're doing it within a framework that's set by the rules of the system. And many of those rules are not, certainly at this point, in any moment of crisis, they're not ones that governments want anymore. They just don't know what to do with it. Everybody's caught in it.
It's fascinating to hear about food system history here, particularly how these regimes document particular transitions. It's a really useful way to understand the world and how things like sugar have shaped the world that we live in. It's clear, too, that it's the monetization of our food system that's created the complexity we're seeing today. Raj, it's clear to see that the food system we're left with today is incredibly complex, and that we're perhaps stuck in some kind of cul-de-sac of organisation that, as Harriet said, nobody wants. What frameworks do you use to help understand the food system?
When I was 5, I just thought in terms of fairness. It's just not fair that there are people in the world who are hungry when there are lots of people with food. I was looking at liberal economics and neoclassical economics as a way of explaining why it is that there are some costs over here, and how comparative advantage might work, and why certain parts of the world were just destined to make bananas so that the rest of the world could enjoy them. But ultimately, I think it's important to return to the origins of economics, which were always political economics, right? You couldn't understand the exchange of goods without understanding the legal structures of the markets in which they were transacted. And that means thinking like the old political economists. I happen to think that Marxism is kind of helpful here, because it helps you understand not only how it is that these capitalist markets work, but they're also their tendency towards crisis, the tendency to look for fixes elsewhere, and the tendency also to perpetually be looking for fixes internationally, to be looking for ways of solving labor crises, for example, or energy crises or raw materials crises domestically, by having imperial powers solve that by going overseas. And I think if our project here is to think about an early warning system for food imperialism, then looking at some of the sort of original mechanisms for achieving that, particularly the way the British behaved in India, can be super, super helpful. Because India is sort of the paradigm case of economics at work. The example that I think is sort of super fascinating is that you've got India at the beginning of the 1800s as a thriving and incredibly wealthy series of kingdoms and fiefdoms, and by the end of the 18th century reduced to absolute penury, far, far, far poorer than Europe. And in between, the operative event is British colonization. And the British came in, and they were pretty canny about the ways that they approach landowners. And so if we're thinking about a way of being on guard for food imperialism, looking at the negotiations between these foreign powers and the owners of land is definitely an area that deserves immediate attention. Because what the British said was, hey, zamindars, landowners, rajas, maharajas, you're stuck in this feudal era where if one year your harvests fail, it's your responsibility as the maharaja to look after your workers. And the problem with that is that then you have to make sure that everyone gets fed, and you have to worry about grain stores, and you have to worry about social equilibrium, and you have to worry about maintaining some sort of position in this moral economy. But if you didn't have to worry about feeding your peasants in times of crisis, you would be able to produce way more food, and you would be able to export it to us, the British, and we would pay you a lot of money for that. And through these economic arguments and then straight military inducements, the feudal system was dismantled. And that meant the systems that had been developed over millennia in India to be able to combat famine or combat crop failure or being ravaged by pests or by disease, all of that was dismantled. And the British, in a way, didn't lie. By the end of the 1800s, India was producing more food per person than it ever had in its history. So there was absolutely a productivity explosion, lots more food. But the problem was that the people who were growing the food couldn't afford to eat it because they were being priced out of the market by the British. And so you had people who were dying alongside these vast new empires of food being shipped out of the country. And the Journal of the British Statistical Society was a little mortified to find that in consulting the records before the British arrived, you'd have a famine once every 120 years. But after the British arrived and after they'd been bringing in this new era of productivity, there was a famine once every 4 years. So if you were in a time machine and you saw a famine in pre-British invasion, you'd have to wait more than a century to see another one. But if after the British came, you saw a famine, you could expect one in the regularity of an election cycle. And that's a predictable consequence of the market because you're selling food to the highest bidder. But if we're interested in food imperialism, then look at what the food imperialists were doing. They were imposing this sort of free market. They were encouraging free trade. They were getting cheap food cheapened at the cost of the lives of Indians and at the expense of the soil and the depletion of water, and taking it all the way over to the UK where it was feeding its workers who otherwise would be restive because their food was too expensive. And that system is what food imperialism looks like. It involves the dismantling of certain kinds of moral economy that are working very well to make sure that no one starves. And instead, you see, again, one of the sort of signatures of food imperialism is an increase in the level of hunger at the same time as you see an increase in the amount of food being produced.
You mentioned power there. For our listeners, this might be the first time that they think about power in the food system. Can you just run us through that?
There's an easy way of thinking about the food system, which is that there are hundreds of millions of farmers around the world and billions of consumers. But between the farmers and us as consumers, there's just a handful of corporations. And this concentration of market power is the reason why in every major food market, there's just a handful of players. In the supermarket realm, it's going to be sort of Walmart and Amazon and Aldi and Carrefour. And, in seeds, it's going to be Monsanto or Pioneer Hybrid and BASF and Sinochem. There'll be just a handful of corporations controlling the overwhelming majority of a market. Now, that suggests that all the ideas that we have about free markets of going into the supermarket and seeing aisles of plenty and seeing all of this stuff being made just for us gets it exactly wrong. That actually the modern supermarket is a place not where stuff is made for us, but where we are made for our food. Because if there are only a handful of corporations that are peddling this stuff to us, then we need to be refashioned into the kinds of people who think that the wildest things on those supermarket shelves are normal. And that's why we often hear this sort of refrain about why we should eat more like our great-grandparents. Now, we can argue whether that's a good idea or not, but one thing is certainly true is that we eat nothing like them. And many of the reasons we eat nothing like them is because of power in shaping our tastes and in our expectations of what food is. So that now we're drinking amazingly strange stuff like Red Bull, for example. Which, if you were trying to explain Red Bull to your ancestor, you'd be like, well, it's sugar. Oh, I know what that is. And it's caffeine. I know what that is. And then it's creatine and taurine. And these are chemicals most commonly found in urine. If you're trying to explain why you're eating sugary caffeinated piss to your ancestor, there's a problem there. And yet it's perfectly normal. Here we are drinking Red Bull. And I think that that's an example of power at work in a way that's so subtle that it's transformed us into these strange creatures that find that kind of beverage perfectly acceptable. I got no moral high ground. And my PhD work was fueled by Red Bull. There's no moral high ground or sort of sanctimoniousness here. But I'm just saying, isn't it weird that we're like this?
Gosh, I'll never look at an energy drink the same way now. But is there something in particular about the food system that shocked or surprised you when you first started looking into it?
The thing that still boggles me is how successful the food industry is at getting everyone to pick up the tab. I found a report in 2012 that was by KPMG. This is not an organization of bomb-throwing anarchists. It assessed a range of industries around the world, and it looked at the oil and gas industry and telecoms and electricity and what have you. And it said, well, look, If we have a very conservative calculation of the amount of damage this industry is doing, and we express that as a percentage of the revenue of this industry, what do we get? And they found the oil and gas industry has 24% of its revenue, if you put a dollar value to the damage it causes, is environmental harm. So you could imagine an oil and gas industry that if the industry managed to take 24% of its revenue and pay it off to the environment, that you would have a sort of environmentally neutral business. And this is oil and gas, right? This is fairly nasty in terms of pollution. But there was one industry that they looked at where no matter how they did the math, the damage outweighed the revenue of the industry, and not by a little, but by a lot. And that's the food industry. And what they found was that for every dollar you spend on food, $2.40 of damage is caused. And that still blows my mind. You might think, oh, well, this is just KPMG getting the numbers wrong again. But this was a finding that was then replicated by independent calculations from the Rockefeller Foundation. The model they use, independently formulated. And again, they ran the numbers. And here in the United States, they found pretty much the same thing, that for every dollar we spend on food, we spend $1 on healthcare, treating the diseases that come from that food, and then an additional dollar and a bit cleaning up the environment and a range of other things. And then a very small part of that is also government subsidy, but a vanishingly small fraction. Mainly, the food industry has, over the course of its history, managed to find elaborate ways that no other industry has of getting other people to pay for the damage that it causes.
That framing there of not picking up the tab is so powerful. Those numbers on the costs of food production that the industry doesn't seem to feel responsible for. Given its dependence on things like ecological depletion and power imbalance, do you see our current global food system as stable, or is it structurally crisis-prone, or is it just completely broken?
The last two, for sure. I don't think there is a way to do the current food system sustainably. And again, that's not me saying that, that's the food industry. I mean, I had a fine conversation with the environmental sustainability guy at Nestle, and I asked him about these KPMG figures, and I said, is it true that the food industry produces more environmental and social harm than the revenue? And he goes, well, yeah, I mean, everyone knows that. But if we published our data, we'd be crucified. So I'm not conjuring some wild and unsustainable industry just because I think capitalism is bad. This is capitalism working as it ought, insofar as other people are picking up the tab. The industry is incredibly powerful and incredibly adept at bribing the right officials when it needs to, evading regulation, and in general setting up the expectation. I think this is the most powerful weapon in its arsenal, is setting up the expectation that large parts of the world ought to be devoted to the production of meat or palm oil, whatever it is, so that we can have cheap snacks, and that should be perfectly normal. I mean, that's an incredible amount of power. So yeah, it's broken structurally, and it's making things much worse. Even if we've solved climate change in terms of energy production, we would still overshoot every planetary boundary because of the food system and the way that it operates right now.
Knowing then how broken the food system is, it's even more shocking that the public, in the global north at least, seem to have little idea about this. How much are these corporations trying to hide the negative impacts of their business?
They're in the PR business, and Nestle for ages has had to do things like justify the way that it markets baby milk formula and the way it continues to violate international norms around that. So it's not some secret hidden inside a vault somewhere. This is an open secret that these industries are in general in the business of social harm in order to be able to make profit. But the rise of the sustainability officer or the chief environment officer is in part because of feelings in the 2010s and the success of some of these campaigns against these companies, that they had to make some concessions. And, the argument I'm making is that most of the things that we need to do to live on a sustainable planet will be a net loss to these industries. However, there are a small number of things that are a net win for the planet and a net win for the company. And that's what the environment officer urges us to look towards. And so you end up with things like solar panels on top of Walmart, or energy efficiency in Walmart's trucking routes. And I'm like, that's great. Actually, if they're pumping out less CO2, or if they're electrifying in order to be able to provide air conditioning inside, rather than causing us to use more fossil fuels, that's a win. But that's as good as it gets. If we're interested in more structural transformation, then there's no sustainability officer who'd be like, maybe we should just get people to buy a little less. That's not going to fly.
Quite. It's not good business to do less business, I guess. So if we were to build a food system centered on justice rather than just profit, what would be structurally different? What does that look like to you?
So we're recording right now at the end of February 2026. There's a big summit happening in Colombia at the moment on land reform. And it's interesting that yesterday here in the United States, the president of the United States was talking about how we shouldn't let large corporations buy up housing so that people in America can have houses. But this fight for the land beneath your home is a global one. And I think if we're interested in food systems, we have to talk about land. We have to talk about land reform, because one of the things that keeps this food system looking the way that it does is a distribution of land, particularly the distribution of large-scale farms, that comes with the large concentration of power and with a certain kind of food system that has evolved to make money off farms at that scale. But most people don't eat soy. Here in the United States, we grow corn on very, very large farms. The biggest single use for that corn here in the United States is ethanol. So we're growing food not to eat it, but to set it on fire. All of that suggests that actually, if we want a sustainable food system, we will need to think about not just what is it that we're going to grow, but what are the accompanying social and biological and physical technologies that come with the shift to something more just. So yes, we do need to talk about land reform. We absolutely have to talk about wages, right? I mean, you can't have an end to cheap food without an end to cheap work. And that means for everyone to be able to afford food as a human right. There are only a couple of countries that don't think that food is a human right. The United States and Israel have consistently opposed the idea of food as a human right at the United Nations. But most other countries have it somewhere on the books, that there is something that's important about being a citizen that entitles you not to starve. And I like that idea. The idea of food as a human right points towards ways of getting food that will be more sort of socially and environmentally sustainable. So it's a big question, Emma. And the great news is that there are lots of places that are experimenting with public supply chains, with paying farmers extra if they're farming agroecologically and making sure that those crops end up in local schools. So providing more money for the farmer and providing food for children that is demonstrably better for them than the standard American diet. These kinds of ways in which governments can do the right thing, I think is quite important. But then the question comes, well, how do we get that? And this is where social movements matter, because governments won't do this, particularly given the power of these large corporations, by their own volition. Here in the US, the largest contributor to Trump's inaugural ball was JBS, the Brazilian meat conglomerate. There's not buying political favor as JBS's superpower. They did that and went to jail for it in Brazil, and they're doing that in the United States too. Being able to fight back against that requires organizing, and it requires politics, and it requires movement formation. And social movements have been, in general, fighting rearguard action against the food industry. But again, occasionally the food industry will offer a SOP like a chief environment officer or whatever it is. But increasingly, we're seeing the failure of those cosmetic solutions. And that's why there are so many places that are now interested in more root and branch transformation, in thinking about what a public supply chain might do. Now, land reform appears in Donald Trump's speech in a very arcane way, but it's interesting that he's saying it at all. For Trump to be able to say we want fewer corporations owning part of the housing stock is unusual, but it points to how the horizon of possibility has shifted a little bit. There wasn't anyone, Democrat or Republican here in the United States, who would have dared say such a thing in the past 50 years. And now all of a sudden, it's not just a thinkable thing. Even the Democrats have been sort of goaded into providing some an inadequate policy as an example of how they're the side of the people. But all of this suggests that there's more interest in thinking through how states can do things because people are restive and increasingly quite upset about the affordability crisis. And as food imperialism breaks down, which is always inherently fragile, right? It's always a fix to a problem that then itself needs fixing, and then you patch it again, and then all of a sudden things go sideways. We're in this weird moment where there's no outside to go. The frontiers that capitalists are exploring now are bloody Mars, or chips in your brain, or new kinds of battery chemistry. But when it comes to the food system, we're out of frontiers. There's no new land to claim. And that means there's reason to worry about the violence that will attend those who are trying to defend land. It's certainly getting worse for land defenders now than it ever has been in the past 50 years. I've been sort of studying this. But I think that there's a way of thinking about possibility here where movements are also organizing, and there is a groundswell in this moment of movements that are really pushing the frontier back and imagining what a sort of collective and just food system might look like.
That feels like a relatively positive note to end this amazing episode on. But before we go, what would be your takeaway messages for our listeners?
I would say the food system creates problems and then offers to sell solutions. So it creates the problems by breaking all of these connections between people and the land, And then those have to be solved one way or another, or the possibility is there to try to solve them for money. Last I looked, there were 10,000 items in some supermarkets. I think there are probably more now. I can't even find my way around. It's too much. And you can't tell things apart, and anything can fit with anything else. Whereas something that's working, a culture that's working, and a landscape that's working have specific interconnections that are not infinitely substitutable, though they can change and do change. What's wrong with it right now simply is it breaks real ties between people and land that have constituted cultures for most of human existence. Whether you're a farmer or not, you live in a world that produces things in this way and allows the soil to regenerate, allows the forests or waterways or all the other parts of the ecosystem to continue or to even get better, maybe. And it allows bodies and people to eat together, to thrive, to be happy, whatever. It happens in villages perched on stilts in mangroves on the coasts of Asia. It happens in the incredibly intricate terraces in Asia or Latin America and in the Andes, where people have to learn all the ways to manage how to keep the forests good, how to keep the water moving in the right way, where to put the fish. And that's what we don't have anymore, anywhere, except a few permaculture farms, which is really a good thing that they're there.
The great joy and tragedy of this moment is that we need to organize against, incipient fascism. If you watch the news every day with dread and you are just mortified at what's happening and the sort of the lurch of politics and the rise of vast empires of intolerance fueled by Elon Musk and his friends, then the only way to fight that is not by doom scrolling, but actually, putting your phone down and going out to organize. And I think if you look again at the history of imperialism, it hasn't ended because people wrote letters by themselves to their elected representatives or their unelected representatives. It ended through organizing. It ended through not just, dear sir, please do this. It ended through militant political organizing. It ended through left-wing organizing. But in the food system, capitalism always produces its own gravediggers, which is the sort of Marxist idea. We could be gravediggers for this too if we wanted. And finding those comrades and those movements gets a shovel in our hands and gets us to feel more powerful than we do right now.
What a powerful message. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you're full up with food facts, but still hungry for more. Join us on the next episode where we'll be talking to Professor Phil Howard and Professor Jennifer Clapp about corporate concentration and power in the food system.
Check out the website, thesalmonandthetomato.org, for the show notes and more information about the podcast series as well as the wider project. From Planet Pulse Pacific, from Emma, Neil, Ben and Kelly, see you next time.